Robert was the first man to be accused of kidnapping Madeleine, and subsequently, of course, he was cleared. Thank you for joining us this morning. Now, like Kate and Jerry, you were this thing under Portuguese law, an acquido, and a suspect. And what sort of effect did that have on your life, Robert?
It was a huge effect. Unfortunately, it's myself and my family. It's completely destroyed it really for a long time.
Very, very difficult for you to get your life back together. You're still living there. You're still just round the corner from where it all happened. And 6 years on, do you hold out any hope that they might actually find out what happened to Madeleine?
I hope so. Yeah, it's one thing I do hope, and I have ever since 2007. I think it's something that needs to be dealt with. Simply, in my case, there are still situations for example, on the internet where you see stories of was he involved or wasn't he involved. So having that situation with this situation resolved would resolve that situation too.
Why did a man who lived only a few steps from the scene so quickly become the prime suspect? Was Robert Murat's eagerness to assist police and the media genuine, or was it a way to conceal a darker truth? Contradictory statements, suspicious phone records, shadowy ties to Sergei Malinka, and even links to intelligence networks. All of these converge to place him at the center of one of the most mysterious cases of the 21st century. Is this the portrait of a kidnapper, or of a man chosen to be the scapegoat? Robert Murat was not a stranger who suddenly appeared on the horizon of Praia da Luz after the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. He was a man whose life and daily routines were already deeply rooted in that small seaside community. At the time of the incident, Murat lived with his mother, Jenny, in a villa called Casa Liliana. The property sat only about 100 to 150 meters from the Ocean Club Resort, where the McCann family had rented their holiday apartment. In such a tight geographic circle, Murat's proximity to the crime scene has always been one of the first details that investigators and journalists seized upon. When a child disappears under mysterious circumstances, the people living literally around the corner inevitably come under scrutiny. Yet what made Murat stand out even more was not only where he lived, but also how he behaved in the immediate aftermath of the case breaking open on the night of May 3, 2007. Witnesses recall seeing him hovering near the police cordons, observing the commotion, and sometimes mingling with the crowd of reporters, locals, and tourists who gathered when word spread that a 3-year-old girl was missing. Instead of maintaining a low profile, Murat projected an unusual eagerness to insert himself into the situation. By the very next morning, he had already offered his services to the police as a translator. Being bilingual in English and Portuguese, he claimed he wanted to help communication between the British family and the Portuguese authorities. At face value, such an act could be interpreted as civic responsibility. But in the psychological analysis of criminal behavior, volunteering to become part of an investigation can also be a sign of overcompensation, a desire to monitor the flow of information, or a strategy to deflect suspicion by presenting oneself as indispensable. Murat's over-helpfulness immediately drew attention from both police and members of the community. Several of the McCann's friends later testified that they saw him near the apartment on the very night Madeleine vanished, between 9 and 10 p.m. This claim stood in sharp contrast to Murat's own account. He insisted that he had been home with his mother the entire evening, unaware of the unfolding drama until the next day. Such a discrepancy between self-reported alibi and external witness testimony is not uncommon in criminal investigations, but it is particularly suspicious in cases of child abduction where the timeline is crucial. The reliability of alibis often comes down to corroboration, and when multiple independent witnesses contradict a suspect's version, investigators are compelled to dig deeper. The psychological question is why someone in Murat's position might deliberately place himself at the center of the search effort. Criminological literature contains numerous examples of offenders who either return to the scene of their crime or attempt to involve themselves in the investigation. Ted Bundy was known to visit police command posts. Arsonists often linger at fire scenes to watch the flames and gauge the reaction of the crowd. Serial offenders sometimes even contact authorities under the guise of offering tips or assistance. The reasons are varied. Some derive a sense of thrill from watching chaos unfold, others seek to control the narrative, and some attempt to divert suspicion by blending in as a concerned bystander. If Murat was indeed guilty, his behavior could fit into this broader pattern. By volunteering as a translator, he not only gained physical access to investigators and the McCann family, but also positioned himself as a gatekeeper of information. Translation is not a neutral act. It allows subtle opportunities to interpret, filter, or even distort meaning. Inspector Veranda, one of the Portuguese officers, later complained that Murat persistently asked about suspects, strategies, and confidential plans behavior that went far beyond the duties of an interpreter. Such conduct suggests more than altruism. It hints at curiosity laced with anxiety, perhaps even the fear of being exposed if the police closed in on the wrong or right lead. On the other hand, if Murat was innocent, his eagerness may have been a cultural mixture of neighborly helpfulness and personal insecurity. Living so close to the epicenter of a global scandal, he might have felt compelled to prove his usefulness. The tragedy is that in high-profile cases, excessive eagerness is often reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. What might be natural enthusiasm to contribute to a desperate search can easily appear sinister when the entire world is searching for an explanation. Still, the witness accounts remain troubling. Fiona Payne, Rachel Oldfield, and Russell O'Brien, all part of the so-called Tapas 7, told Portuguese police they remembered seeing Murat in the vicinity on the evening of May 3. Charlotte Pennington, a childcare worker at the resort, provided a similar observation. Their statements contradicted Murat's claim of being at home. Some might argue that witness memory is fallible, especially in stressful circumstances. But when several independent people describe the same presence at the same location, investigators cannot simply dismiss the overlap as coincidence. The contradictions raise a chilling possibilities. Murat could have been watching the McCann apartment that night, perhaps having studied the family's patterns during the days leading up to May 3. Offenders in child abduction cases often perform surveillance beforehand. They look for vulnerabilities, open windows, lax routines, distracted parents. The McCann's practice of leaving their children asleep while dining at the tapas bar became a focal point of criticism. If Murat was aware of this habit and living so close, it would have been difficult not to notice he may have identified a window of opportunity. From a psychological standpoint, this hypothesis is plausible. Murat was in his mid-30s, going through a divorce, and facing limited career prospects. He lived with his mother, a situation that might foster feelings of regression or inadequacy. Reports later surfaced of disturbing anecdotes from his youth, suggesting deviant behavior and episodes of cruelty. While those accounts cannot be treated as definitive proof, they shape the profile of a man who might be capable of transgressive acts. In such cases, the act of abduction can represent not only a desire for control, but also a distorted attempt to recapture something perceived as lost, such as the innocence of childhood or the stability of a family unit. In constructing a narrative around Murat, one must be careful to separate evidence from conjecture. The official police files did not produce definitive forensic proof linking him to Madeleine's disappearance. No DNA, fingerprints, or direct physical trace was found in his home or vehicle. Yet suspicion persisted because of the convergence of circumstantial factors: his proximity, his eagerness, his contradictory alibi, and the testimony of multiple witnesses. Each of these alone might be explainable. Together, they form a troubling pattern that cannot be ignored. This brings us to the first central hypothesis of this documentary: Robert Murat may have been more than a helpful neighbor or an unfortunate scapegoat. He could have been the observer lurking on the margins, studying the McCann family, waiting for the moment when opportunity and motive aligned. The night of May 3 offered exactly such a moment. The parents dined away from the apartment. The children were left unattended. The resort was bustling enough to mask movement, but small enough to allow a local resident to slip in and out unnoticed. If Murat had already followed their routines, he may have chosen that night as the culmination of his surveillance. Of course, one must also entertain the counterargument. Could it be that Murat's eagerness and visibility made him too obvious to be the perpetrator? Criminals who plan meticulously usually seek invisibility, not attention. Was Murat's behavior the clumsy over-engagement of a man desperate to be seen as helpful, or was it the calculated involvement of someone who needed to monitor the investigation from the inside? This tension is the essence of why Murat remains one of the most controversial figures in the Madeleine McCann case. When investigators peel back the first layers of any criminal mystery, the alibi is often the cornerstone they examine. Where was the suspect at the critical time? Who can vouch for his or her whereabouts? In the case of Robert Murat, the alibi seemed straightforward at first. He claimed that on the evening of May 3, 2007, when Madeleine McCann was reported missing, he was at home with his mother, Jenny. Their villa, Casa Liliana, sat just 100 to 150 meters from the McCann's holiday apartment. According to Murat, he spent the evening quietly, never venturing near the Ocean Club until the next morning, when he volunteered his services as a translator. On paper, it sounded simple. A man and his mother, spending a calm evening at home. Yet, as investigators know, alibis supported only by family members are among the weakest forms of defense. Relatives are emotionally invested, and they have every reason to protect their loved ones, whether through denial, selective memory, or active collusion. When conflicting accounts began to emerge from multiple independent witnesses, the once neat alibi started to unravel. Members of the so-called Tapas 7 friends who had been dining with Kate and Jerry McCann at the Tapas bar that night reported something troubling. Fiona Payne, Rachel Oldfield, and Russell O'Brien all told Portuguese police that they remembered seeing Robert Murat in the vicinity of the apartment during the very window of time when Madeleine was believed to have been taken. Their statements placed him not in the safety of his mother's villa, but in the chaotic swirl of activity surrounding the Ocean Club. Adding weight to their accounts was Charlotte Pennington, a childcare worker employed at the resort. She, too, recalled seeing Murat near the scene. These recollections directly contradicted Murat's assertion that he had remained at home, unaware of the disappearance until the following day. 4 witnesses, none of them related to each other by family ties, describing the same man at the same location, on the same night. It is the kind of consistency that investigators rarely dismiss as chance. Perhaps the most haunting detail came from Jane Tanner, another member of the Tapas group. Around 9:15 p.m., she told police she saw a man carrying a small child in pajamas, walking away from the McCann's apartment. The image burned itself into the collective imagination of the investigation. According to Tanner, the man was heading in the direction of Robert Murat's home. This does not mean the carrier was necessarily Murat, but the trajectory was enough to cast suspicion. When mapped on paper, the route pointed like an arrow toward Casa Liliana, raising the possibility that Madeleine's abductor could have vanished into the very neighborhood where Murat lived. Complicating matters further were the electronic footprints left behind by Murat's phone. Technology has a way of challenging narratives, and in this case, the call record spoke louder than recollections. At 11:38 p.m. on May 3, Murat's phone registered an outgoing call to his girlfriend, Mykala Walksuch. Just 1 minute later, at 11:39, another call went out to Sergei Malinka, a Russian-born web designer and longtime associate of Murat. These were not brief, accidental dials. They were conscious connections made during the critical hours of the disappearance. Why would a man who insisted he spent the entire evening quietly at home with his mother place 2 calls, almost back-to-back, so close to midnight? If he was unaware of the events until the following morning, why was his phone active in the late hours of the night? More troubling still, when he first gave his statement to police, Murat omitted these calls altogether. It was only when confronted with the phone records that he admitted they had taken place, offering vague explanations he could not substantiate. To investigators, this was not simply forgetfulness. It looked like a deliberate attempt to conceal his true activities. Even Jenny Murat, his mother and supposed anchor for the Alibi, introduced complications. In some interviews, she claimed Robert was home all evening. In others, the timeline shifted, creating inconsistencies about when he first became aware of the disappearance. Such contradictions may appear minor on the surface, but in the forensic analysis of alibis, small cracks can widen into major fissures. Did Jenny adjust her story under the pressure of protecting her son, or was her memory genuinely unreliable due to stress and shock? Either way, the effect was the same. The alibi she provided could not be treated as solid ground. From a psychological standpoint, the idea of a fabricated alibi is both common and deeply telling. Individuals who plan crimes often anticipate the need for a fallback story. They arrange to be seen by someone trustworthy, they make sure their timeline sounds ordinary, and they rely on the natural instinct of family members to shield them. In Murat's case, claiming to have been at home with his mother was a predictable choice. Yet the strength of an alibi lies not in predictability, but in verifiability. Independent witnesses and digital records chipped away at the foundation of his story, suggesting that the narrative may have been constructed not to reflect reality but to obscure it. Consider again the testimony of the top 7 witnesses. Some skeptics argue that memory is malleable, that people can be influenced by media coverage or group discussions. Yet the police reports reveal that these individuals gave their statements independently. They described Murat's distinctive presence, a man who stood out because of his appearance and his proximity to the events. If all of them were mistaken, it would represent a remarkable collective error. If they were not, then Murat's alibi collapses entirely. The phone calls offer another dimension of analysis. Criminal psychologists often note that the stress of committing or concealing a crime manifests in communication patterns. Offenders reach out to confidants, check in with accomplices, or attempt to create a digital trail that appears innocuous but is in fact incriminating. The fact that Murat contacted both his girlfriend and his associate Malinka within a minute of each other at such a crucial time raises red flags. Was he updating them, coordinating something, or were these calls routine, innocent coincidences that just happened to fall within the window of Madeleine's disappearance? Without additional context, the answers remain elusive, but the timing cannot be ignored. The contradictions from his mother add yet another layer. In law enforcement training, officers are taught to look not only at what is said, but how consistently it is repeated. When a witness alters details over time, it is either because memory is decaying or because the story is being adjusted to fit external pressures. Jenny's shifting recollections may not prove deception, but they weaken her credibility as the sole corroborator of her son's whereabouts. What emerges from this tangled web is a hypothesis that must be considered seriously. Robert Murat's alibi may have been deliberately manufactured. Rather than a man spending a quiet evening at home, he could have been circulating near the Ocean Club, monitoring the McCann apartment, and positioning himself for involvement. The alibi with his mother provided a convenient cover story. The phone calls late at night suggest activity inconsistent with his claims. The multiple witnesses undermine his insistence that he was nowhere near the crime scene. If this hypothesis is true, then Murat's behavior fits a classic pattern of offenders who attempt to control not only the crime, but also the investigation afterward. By creating a false narrative of being safely at home, he sought to insulate himself from suspicion. Yet the more he insisted on that story, the more the external evidence contradicted him. It is the paradox of deception. The harder one clings to the false account, the more fragile it becomes under the weight of scrutiny. For investigators, the challenge was to piece together a coherent timeline from fragments that pointed in different directions. On one side was Murat's unwavering claim of domestic tranquility with his mother. On the other was a chorus of witnesses, phone records, and inconsistencies that painted a different picture. The truth, if it can ever be fully known, likely lies somewhere in between. But what matters in this case is not only the factual accuracy of Murat's alibi, but also the perception it created. An alibi riddled with holes becomes less a shield of innocence and more a banner of suspicion. In the broader narrative of the Madeleine McCann case, Murat's shaky alibi became a turning point. It marked the moment when he transitioned from helpful neighbor and translator to arguido, an official suspect under Portuguese law. That shift was not driven by a single piece of irrefutable evidence, but by the accumulation of contradictions, the sense that his story did not align with the observable reality. Ultimately, the unanswered question remains, was Robert Murat simply an unlucky man whose proximity, personality, and phone activity converged into a perfect storm of suspicion? Or was he actively engaged in creating a false narrative to hide a darker truth? The alibi he offered was meant to protect him, but instead, it raised the most haunting suspicion of all that he may have been present, watching, and perhaps participating in the crime that stole a child and shocked the world. In every high-profile criminal case, investigators follow the web of relationships surrounding their suspect. Who were they speaking to? Who occupied their social circle? Who received the late-night phone calls when secrets weighed heaviest? In Robert Murat's story, one name emerges repeatedly, woven into the fabric of suspicion: Sergei Malinka. Malinka was a Russian-born computer programmer who had settled in Portugal, running a small business building websites. On the surface, he was young, ambitious, and technically skilled. But his reputation in the community was mixed. Some saw him as hardworking, others described him as secretive and elusive. What became undeniable was his professional and personal connection to Robert Murat. They were not casual acquaintances. They worked together on plans for an online real estate venture, and they communicated frequently, so frequently that when Portuguese police pulled the phone records, they were struck by the density of contact between the two men. The call logs from early May 2007 painted a troubling picture. On the night Madeleine disappeared, Murat placed a call to Malinka at 11:39 p.m., just 1 minute after calling his girlfriend, Michaela Waltzuch. The timing was critical. These were not casual midday conversations about business. They were late-night calls during the very hours when the search for Madeleine had already begun to intensify. To investigators, the question was obvious: why would Murat, who claimed to be quietly at home, reach out to Malinka at such a charged moment? Police quickly discovered that the relationship between Murat and Malinka was not new. They had been in regular contact long before Madeleine's disappearance. Malinka had even helped design a website for Murat's real estate ambitions, a venture dubbed Ramajan, a name blending Robert, Michaela, and their supposed partnership. This overlap of personal, romantic, and professional connections suggested more than a simple business acquaintance. It hinted at a circle of trust, a network within which information could flow and secrets could be kept. When the press got hold of these details, the story took on a life of its own. British tabloids, never ones to shy away from sensationalism, began linking Murat and Malinka to lurid theories of pedophile rings and hidden chambers. Headlines screamed about pedophile circles and secret rooms, allegedly concealed within Murat's property. Some reports even claimed that police dogs had alerted to the scent of death inside his house. The implication was stark, that Murat and Malinka might have been part of a larger network involved in child exploitation or trafficking. Yet the forensic reality was less definitive. The cadaver dogs did indeed alert in certain areas of Casa Liliana, Murat's home, raising eyebrows and intensifying suspicion. But subsequent DNA testing failed to recover any trace of Madeleine McCann. This mismatch between the dog's instincts and the laboratory results fueled controversy. Supporters of the McCanns seized on the alerts as proof of foul play, while Murat's defenders pointed to the absence of physical evidence as exoneration. The truth, as often in this case, lay in a gray zone where certainty evaporated and speculation thrived. Still, the convergence of factors was unsettling. Murat lived steps from the McCann apartment. He volunteered as a translator, inserting himself into the investigation. Multiple witnesses placed him near the scene on the night of May 3. His alibi conflicted with his phone activity, and his closest associate was a young programmer with whom he shared intense communication at precisely the wrong time. Even if no forensic evidence tied them to Madeleine, the circumstantial web was thick and sticky. From a psychological perspective, the possibility of Murat being part of a broader network is chilling but not far-fetched. Offenders who act within organized rings often blend into their communities, presenting as ordinary neighbors or helpful citizens. Murat fit this mold perfectly. He was known to locals, polite enough, visible enough, and positioned in such close proximity to the Ocean Club that his presence rarely raised alarm. Yet beneath this surface of familiarity lay contradictions, strains in his personal life, whispers of a troubled past, and a set of relationships that led police to consider darker possibilities. If Murat was indeed part of a network, what role might he have played? Analysts have speculated on several possibilities. He could have been the watcher, the man with eyes on the apartment, noting when the McCanns went to dinner and when the children were left alone. His proximity would have made surveillance effortless. Malinka, with his technical background, could have served as a facilitator, someone skilled in communication, encryption, or coordination. Others in the network unnamed could have taken on more direct roles, such as transportation or exploitation. This structure, while speculative, mirrors patterns observed in organized child trafficking groups across Europe. The phone records lend weight to such speculation. Communication between Murat and Malinka was not sporadic but sustained. The late-night calls suggest urgency, coordination, or reassurance. When paired with the timing of Madeleine's disappearance, the calls look less like business and more like crisis management. Was Murat checking in to confirm that everything had gone according to plan? Was he seeking alibis or corroboration? Or was he simply leaning on a friend during a moment of panic as suspicion began to spread? Without direct transcripts, the content remains a mystery, but the context is damning. The British media's role in shaping public perception cannot be overstated. By painting Murat and Malinka as central figures in a pedophile conspiracy, they amplified suspicion to a fever pitch. While sensationalism may have outpaced evidence, the narrative stuck. Once a person is linked to such crimes in the public imagination, the stain rarely fades. For Murat, the consequences were devastating. He became not just a suspect, but a symbol, the neighbor who might embody the worst fears of parents everywhere. It is worth examining why such narratives gain traction. Communities confronted with unspeakable crimes often search for coherence, for villains who make sense of the chaos. Linking Murat to Malinka, layering in rumors of secret rooms and trafficking rings, offered a framework that explained the otherwise inexplicable. Whether true or not, it provided a story that satisfied the public's hunger for answers. Psychologically, it allowed people to externalize fear, to imagine that evil resided in a small circle of men rather than in the randomness of chance or the failures of parental vigilance. Yet within this simplification lies a dangerous truth. Sometimes the line between reality and myth blurs. Was Murat a willing participant in a larger criminal network? Or was he a convenient scapegoat onto whom suspicions of international trafficking were projected? The evidence remains circumstantial, but the patterns are difficult to ignore. From a profiling standpoint, Murat embodied contradictions. He was close to the community yet isolated in his private life. He was eager to help yet too eager, pressing for information beyond his role. He was connected to others, like Malinka, whose presence complicated the narrative. Such contradictions often signal deeper conflicts within a person's psyche. They suggest a man torn between the desire to belong and the pull of darker impulses, between visibility and secrecy. Ultimately, the link between Murat and Malinka underscores one of the most unsettling possibilities in the Madeleine McCann case, that this was not simply the act of an opportunistic intruder, but part of a broader network of exploitation. Even in the absence of definitive forensic proof, the associations, the calls, the dog's alerts, and the media narratives converge into a portrait of suspicion. Whether Murat was an active conspirator or an unwitting man whose friendships doomed him to suspicion, his connections cast a long shadow. In a case already rife with mystery, the network around him became a mirror of society's deepest fears. That predators can operate in plain sight, shielded by ordinary facades, and that trust in neighbors may sometimes mask danger lurking only steps away. When law enforcement investigates a potential suspect in a major case, they do not stop at the immediate circumstances. They go back sometimes decades looking for the roots of behavior, the psychological scars, and the unresolved conflicts that may explain what later erupts into criminal suspicion. In the story of Robert Murat, those who have studied his background often point to a troubling blend of personal turmoil, strained relationships, and disturbing childhood anecdotes. Together, these elements feed into one of the most uncomfortable hypotheses of the Madeleine McCann case, that his personal history and psychological state may have created a motive both dark and pathological. At the time of Madeleine's disappearance, Robert Murat was in the middle of a painful chapter of his personal life. His marriage to Dawn, a British woman several years older than him, had broken down. They had a daughter, Sophia, who was not yet 5 years old. Murat had persuaded Dawn to move to Portugal, but the arrangement quickly collapsed, and she returned to Norfolk with the child. Murat stayed in Portugal, living with his mother in her villa, Casa Liliana. The separation was bitter, involving disputes over custody and visits. He longed for more time with Sophia, but found himself constrained by distance and by the choices his estranged wife had made. Friends later recalled that Murat sometimes remarked on the resemblance between Madeleine McCann and his own daughter. The observation might appear innocuous at first glance. People often note similarities between children, but in the charged context of a child abduction investigation, such comments can take on a sinister edge. To suggest that Madeleine looked like his daughter was to blur the line between paternal longing and an unhealthy fixation. Psychologists who specialize in family crime note that offenders occasionally project their frustrations with custody disputes onto other children who resemble their own. In such cases, the crime becomes a grotesque substitution, a way to assert control over a situation where they otherwise feel powerless. The possibility of this motive is compounded by testimony that surfaced during the investigation. A man named Carlos Costa, who had known the Murat family for years, gave a statement to Portuguese police describing Robert's disturbing behavior as a child and adolescent. Costa's account painted a portrait not of a shy or misunderstood boy, but of a youth marked by violence, deviance, and cruelty. He claimed that even as a child, Robert displayed a tendency toward aggression, once throwing heavy vases from a veranda without caring who might be underneath. More disturbing still were stories of experimentation with animals. Costa claimed that during his youth, Robert showed troubling attitudes toward animals, including an episode where a cat scratched him and he allegedly harmed it afterward, as well as another occasion in which he was reported to have behaved inappropriately toward the family dog. These allegations, while never tested in court, were specific and unsettling. To criminologists, they resonate with known patterns. Acts of cruelty to animals are one of the classic early warning signs in what psychologists call the triad of sociopathy. They suggest a lack of empathy, an attraction to power and dominance, and a willingness to gratify urges without moral restraint. When combined with violence toward family members, as Costa also reported, describing how Robert would lash out at his mother when reprimanded, the picture becomes darker still. According to Costa, Murat received psychiatric treatment in the UK as a teenager, another clue that his struggles were recognized early on, but perhaps never fully resolved. The media amplified these accounts, seizing upon them to create a public image of Murat as the loner. Journalists portrayed him as a man in his 30s who, despite business ambitions, was living once again under his mother's roof. In tabloid shorthand, this dependency became symbolic. It painted him as immature, emotionally stunted, unable to function as a fully independent adult. The implication was that beneath his polite surface, he harbored resentment, frustration, and perhaps a desire for control he could not otherwise exert in his daily life. To understand how this personal history could feed into the case of Madeleine McCann, it is useful to consider the psychological dynamics at play. Murat's separation from his daughter, his reduced role as a father, and his reliance on his mother may have created a cocktail of humiliation and longing. Seeing Madeleine, a child who resembled Sophia, could have triggered both envy and desire. In one interpretation, he may have sought to reclaim through Madeleine the paternal role he felt was being denied to him. In another, darker interpretation, the fixation was less about fatherhood and more about gratification, using a vulnerable child as a proxy for unresolved urges. The hypothesis that Murat may have been driven by a sick motive, as some investigators phrased it, is grounded in these contradictions. On the one hand, he was a man known to his community, polite enough to be entrusted as a translator for police. On the other, He was remembered as a youth capable of sadistic acts, now grown into an adult who lived on the margins, divorced, dependent, and embittered. In criminological terms, such duality often hides the potential for dangerous behavior. Media portrayals sharpened this narrative. Photographs of Murat standing alone near police cordons or being escorted by officers were circulated with captions that emphasized his isolation. Reporters used terms like strange or odd to describe his mannerisms. In the absence of hard evidence, these images served as psychological cues to the public, reinforcing the idea that Murat was not just a suspect, but a man whose entire life trajectory pointed toward deviance. What makes this strand of the story so compelling and so unsettling is the way it ties motive to personal history. If Madeleine resembled his daughter, and if Murat felt deprived of paternal rights, the abduction could be seen as a twisted attempt to regain control. If, as Carlos Coster alleged, he had a past marked by deviance and cruelty, then the crime could also be interpreted as the ultimate expression of those dark impulses. Either way, the motive is personal, rooted not in organized networks or international trafficking, but in the tormented psychology of one man. It is important, however, to acknowledge the limitations of this hypothesis. Testimony like Costa's, while detailed, was never scrutinized in court. Some of his claims may have been colored by bias, memory, or hearsay. Similarly, the interpretation of Murat's remarks about Madeleine resembling his daughter depends heavily on context. What might have been a benign comment of observation became loaded with menace once suspicion attached itself to him. In psychological profiling, context is everything, and the line between evidence and inference is thin. Still, when woven into the broader tapestry of the case, the contradictions in Murat's alibi, the late-night phone calls, the witness sightings, the personal motive theory gains traction. It does not stand alone, but rather reinforces the suspicion already surrounding him. The narrative of a man whose life was marked by dependency, estrangement, and alleged deviance fits too neatly with the archetype of offenders in child abduction cases to be ignored. From a psychological standpoint, the most chilling element is the possibility of projection. Offenders who feel powerless in their adult relationships sometimes seek power in the most vulnerable of victims. For Murat, estranged from his wife, limited in his access to his daughter, and living under the shadow of his mother's household, Madeleine may have represented both temptation and opportunity. She was a child close in age to Sophia, visible in the neighborhood, left alone by parents who assumed safety in numbers. If Murat harbored such impulses, the circumstances could have appeared as a chance to act upon them. In sum, Robert Murat's past and personal life provide fertile ground for hypothesis. They do not prove guilt, but they explain why suspicion clung so tightly to him. A troubled youth marked by violence and deviance, an adulthood of dependence and disappointment, a custody battle that stripped him of paternal control, all these threads weave into a narrative of motive. Whether he acted upon that motive remains unproven, but the psychological profile is stark. It is the portrait of a man for whom the boundaries between longing, resentment, and pathology may have blurred fatally on the night of May 3, 2007. By the morning of May 4, 2007, barely hours after Kate McCann had raised the alarm that her daughter was missing, Robert Murat had already positioned himself inside the heart of the investigation. He was no longer just the neighbor who lived 100 yards from the Ocean Club. He was now the man sitting beside detectives, interpreting witness statements, relaying questions and answers, and, in effect, standing as a bridge between two law enforcement cultures. The speed with which Murat assumed this role is striking. Most suspects or potential witnesses remain on the periphery during those first frantic days. They watch from their gardens or appear occasionally in background photographs. Murat, however, crossed the tape. He was suddenly part of the official process. The obvious question is, how did he get there? Two explanations emerged, each pointing to a different chain of events, and both raising questions of their own. The first account is almost quaint in its simplicity. According to Murat, he had been standing outside Casa Liliana on the morning of May 4 when he just happened to encounter Stephen Carpenter, a fellow Briton who was holidaying in Praia da Luz. Carpenter knew that Murat spoke both English and Portuguese, and allegedly suggested that his skills could be useful to the police. Within hours, Murat was inside the Ocean Club complex, translating for the McCanns and their friends. It was the picture of a good Samaritan, a bilingual neighbor stepping forward in a moment of crisis. But the second version is far more unsettling. Portuguese journalist Paulo Reis reported that the British Embassy in Lisbon had itself recommended Robert Murat to the Portuguese police. Embassy staff, Reis claimed, vouched for him on the basis of earlier work he had done as an interpreter for Norfolk Police in the United Kingdom. He was known to them, trusted by them, and carried letters of recommendation to prove it. If this account is true, Murat was not the accidental volunteer of Carpenter's story. He was someone already recognized within British official circles and placed into the investigation with diplomatic blessing. The contrast between these two narratives is more than a matter of detail. It speaks to motive. If Murat merely stumbled into the role, the suspicion of opportunism clings to him, a man desperate for involvement, pushing himself forward. If, however, the embassy engineered his insertion, then he may have been a plant, an insider positioned to monitor, shape, or even manipulate the course of the investigation from within. Either version is troubling. Once inside, Murat's behavior quickly drew scrutiny. Inspector Veranda, one of Gonçalo Amaral's senior staff officers, filed a report on May 11, less than a week after Murat began translating. The complaints were damning. According to Veranda, Murat did not limit himself to the neutral role of interpreter. Instead, he persistently overstepped. He asked questions about potential suspects, probed the strategy of the investigation, and showed keen interest in upcoming police plans. He attempted to peek at confidential documents, displayed detailed knowledge of the Ocean Club layout, and even tried to influence the direction of inquiries. Most telling of all, Veranda noted, Murat repeatedly suggested that foreigners were responsible for abducting Madeleine. For a translator, such behavior was extraordinary. The task of an interpreter is mechanical, to reproduce faithfully what one party says to another. It is not to comment, inquire, or hypothesize. Murat's eagerness to push beyond translation suggested a deeper agenda. Was he simply curious, or was he actively gathering intelligence information that could be relayed elsewhere? Amaral, who already harbored doubts about Murat's presence, did not let the complaints pass. Within days, Murat was quietly removed from translation duties. To the Portuguese detectives, he was no longer a helpful neighbor, but a man who had attempted to insinuate himself into the core of the case. For Amaral, this was enough to cast him as someone who could not be trusted. From a psychological perspective, Murat's behavior fits two possible models. In the first, he was an anxious outsider desperate to appear useful, overcompensating by involving himself too deeply. In the second, he was a deliberate insider planted, approved, or at least tolerated by British authorities whose mission was to monitor the Portuguese investigation. Each model carries very different implications. The former paints him as socially clumsy, the latter as strategically dangerous. The embassy connection makes the second model difficult to dismiss. Why would British diplomats go out of their way to recommend Robert Murat? Why was he already known to them as a reliable interpreter? And how did they obtain letters of reference from Norfolk Police? This was not a man randomly plucked from a crowd. This was someone with a history of cooperation with law enforcement, someone flagged to Portuguese authorities as trustworthy at a moment when the entire world was watching. If Murat was indeed an insider, the timing of his insertion is critical. Recall that, according to several independent analyses, Madeleine may have died days before May 3. If that theory holds weight, then by the morning of May 4 the narrative of abduction was already being constructed. Having a British asset inside the Portuguese inquiry at that very moment would have allowed London to monitor, and perhaps guide, the way the case unfolded. Murat, with his bilingual fluency and his local residence, was the perfect candidate. What Amaral saw as meddling may therefore have been part of a broader design. Murat's insistent questions about strategy, suspects, and investigative plans could have been reconnaissance. His attempts to steer suspicion toward foreigners might have been deliberate deflection, reinforcing the abduction narrative, and his prying into documents would have provided him with intelligence he could pass on. Of course, There is another interpretation. Perhaps Murat was simply unable to resist curiosity. Living next to the epicenter of a global mystery, having the chance to sit with detectives and hear the details firsthand, he might have been overwhelmed. In this view, he was not an insider but an opportunist, a man who could not help but ask too many questions. Yet even in this softer scenario, his conduct was reckless. It blurred the lines between helper and suspect, inviting suspicion from police who were already wary of his proximity to the crime scene. Amiral's decision to remove him was pragmatic. Investigations rely on trust, and Murat had undermined that trust. Once stripped of his translator role, he reverted to what he had been before: the neighbor, the bystander, the man who could not account for his movements. And from that moment on, suspicion grew. The deeper issue, however, remains unresolved. Was Murat merely overeager, or was he a channel for something larger? The embassy's involvement, the Norfolk police connection, and the letters of recommendation suggest premeditation. If true, then Murat's role as translator was not accidental at all but engineered. He was not simply the neighbor who walked across the street. He was the insider, placed there to serve interests beyond the Portuguese inquiry. For the McCann case, this possibility is explosive. If British officials were inserting their own people into the investigation, it suggests an agenda beyond the search for a missing child. It suggests a desire to control the narrative, to keep certain possibilities off the table, and to ensure that the abduction hypothesis remained dominant. Murat, whether willing or reluctant, became a symbol of that intervention. By mid-May, his transformation was complete. On May 4, he was the helpful translator, standing at police briefings and assisting interviews. By May 15, he was arguido, a formal suspect. The speed of that shift reflects both the fragility of his position and the suspicions his behavior aroused. What began as an apparent act of service ended as a cloud of doubt, and the man who claimed to be helping the investigation was instead accused of obstructing it. In retrospect, Murat's short-lived role as translator illustrates the razor's edge between insider and suspect. To some, he was a man with useful skills, recommended by authorities, eager to contribute. To others, he was a plant, a manipulator, a man who stepped over the line from translation into interference. For Amiral and his team, the distinction mattered less than the result. Murat could not be trusted. The larger question lingers still. Was Robert Murat, from the very beginning, meant to be inside the investigation? Was he the embassy's chosen observer, tasked with guiding and reporting? Or was he just a neighbor who could not resist curiosity, undone by his own overconfidence? Either way, his rapid journey from interpreter to suspect remains one of the most extraordinary twists in the Madeleine McCann case. It set the stage for everything that followed: the witness identifications, the media frenzy, and the enduring suspicion that the man next door was never just a neighbor at all. On May 14, 2007, just 11 days after Madeleine McCann was reported missing, Robert Murat's world imploded. That morning, Portuguese detectives arrived at Casa Liliana, the villa he shared with his mother in Praia da Luz. They came not as colleagues in a search effort, but as enforcers with a warrant. Murat was taken in for interrogation. His home and property were scoured for evidence. Computers were seized, vehicles searched, and rooms inspected for hidden chambers. For a man who had been translating for police only a week earlier, the reversal was breathtaking. He went overnight from being a helper to being the first arguido formal suspect in one of the most infamous missing child cases in history. The British press wasted no time. By the evening, headlines blared across front pages. Interpreter becomes suspect. The strange man next door. Murat the mystery neighbor. The Daily Mirror and other tabloids painted him as eccentric, overly eager, and suspiciously entangled in the investigation. Sky News, which had reporters embedded in Praia da Luz from the earliest days, broadcast his name repeatedly, seeding doubt into households across Britain. And Laurie Campbell, a reporter for the Sunday Mirror, reportedly described him to police as creepy and strange, adding fuel to the fire that was now roaring around him. In a matter of hours, Murat had been transformed from the neighbor with bilingual skills into a caricature: the loner, the oddball, the potential predator. Photographs of him standing near police cordons were recycled and reframed as sinister. Journalists scoured his past, dredging up stories of divorce, custody battles, and failed business ventures. The narrative was clear: he was not just nearby when Madeleine disappeared. He fit the mold of the kind of man the public feared most. The problem was that much of the supposed evidence did not hold up. Within days, rumors swirled that DNA belonging to Madeleine had been found in his house or car. These stories collapsed under scrutiny. Forensic testing revealed no link between Murat's property and the missing child. There were whispers of a secret room inside Casa Liliana, a supposed chamber where a victim could be held. Again, police found nothing of the sort. What remained were impressions, suspicions, and sensationalized headlines, not hard proof. And yet, the damage was done. Murat's name had been plastered across Europe as the prime suspect. His mother wept on camera, protesting his innocence. His life and reputation lay in tatters. The public, meanwhile, split sharply into two camps. For many, Murat was the devil next door, the man who had inserted himself into the search only to mask his guilt. They cited his proximity to the McCann apartment, his eagerness to act as a translator, and the witness statements that allegedly placed him near the scene on the night of May 3. To others, however, he looked more like a scapegoat, a man plucked from obscurity and thrust into the role of suspect, because the investigation needed direction, and perhaps because British authorities needed a distraction. The idea of Murat as a Patsy is not easily dismissed. From the beginning, his presence inside the investigation had been unusual. As outlined earlier, he was either introduced to police through a chance encounter with Stephen Carpenter or recommended by the British Embassy itself. The second version, supported by Portuguese journalist Paulo Reis, suggests he was already known to diplomatic staff and had letters of recommendation from Norfolk police. If true, Murat was not simply a neighbor volunteering to help. He was someone handpicked and trusted by British officials. This context makes the sudden turn on May 14 especially intriguing. Why would authorities, and the British press aligned with them, so aggressively target a man who had only days earlier been vouched for? One interpretation is that Murat was expendable. Once suspicion began to mount, he could serve as the perfect diversion of visible, convenient suspect around whom media frenzy could be whipped up, while other avenues of inquiry faded quietly into the background. Psychologically, the experience of being cast as a patsy can be devastating. It strips a person of agency, transforming them into a vessel for others' narratives. If Murat was innocent, he became the victim not only of circumstance, but also of a machinery that required someone to bear the weight of suspicion. In this view, his eagerness to help was twisted into evidence of guilt, his proximity to the Ocean Club into proof of opportunity, and his unusual mannerisms into indicators of deviance. But what if he was not merely a pawn? Some analysts argue that Murat may have stepped into the role willingly, aware that suspicion might come but trusting he would ultimately be protected. His calmness during initial questioning, his decision to speak to police without legal counsel, and his lack of visible outrage when accused suggest a man who, at some level, expected the storm. Could it be that he believed the authorities who had inserted him into the case would shield him from lasting harm? If so, he miscalculated. Though no charges ever stuck, his reputation was ruined. The distinction between being trapped and being a willing player is crucial. If Murat was a patsy, he represents an example of how investigations, especially those saturated with international politics and media pressure, can manufacture villains to satisfy public demand. If he was complicit, he illustrates the danger of inserting insiders into investigations under the guise of helpfulness. Either way, his trajectory on May 14 marked a turning point. The focus shifted from an unknown abductor to a man with a name, a face, and a house just steps away from where Madeleine was last seen. The symbolism mattered. For the public, having a suspect, even a flawed one, provided a semblance of progress. For the media, Murat was the perfect character, strange enough to intrigue, ordinary enough to terrify, close enough to implicate. For investigators under pressure, he was at least a lead to pursue. And for those who believe in deeper conspiracies, he was the fall guy, chosen not because he was guilty, but because he was useful. In retrospect, The raid on Casa Liliana and the spectacle that followed feel less like the unveiling of truth and more like theater. No DNA, no secret chamber, no forensic link. What endured was narrative, the story of the strange interpreter who became the prime suspect. That story has never fully detached from Robert Murat's name, even after he won libel damages from newspapers years later. So, was he trapped or a willing player? The answer may never be clear. If trapped, Murat's case is a cautionary tale about how quickly suspicion, fueled by rumor and amplified by media, can destroy lives. If willing, he becomes something more insidious. An insider who entered the investigation with foreknowledge, later sacrificed once his role was no longer useful. Either way, May 14, 2007, was the day Robert Murat ceased to be just the neighbor. He became the embodiment of suspicion. A man cast in a role that the world was eager to watch, even if the script was written by forces beyond his control. By late 2007, the Madeleine McCann investigation was fractured. The Portuguese police had lost their lead investigator, Gon Alo Amaral, under intense political pressure. The McCanns themselves had been declared arguidos, formal suspects, in September. Robert Murat remained under suspicion too, his life torn apart by the earlier storm of allegations. And then, on November 13, something extraordinary happened, a secret meeting in the Algarve, a gathering that few outside the inner circle knew about at the time. The location was the Villa Salsalitas, owned by Robert Murat's aunt and uncle, Ralph and Sally Everly. Around the table that day were 5 members of what might be called the Murat camp: Robert himself, his mother Jennifer, his aunt and uncle, and his lawyer Francisco Pagarit. Facing them were 2 representatives of the McCann team, Brian Kennedy, a wealthy businessman who had taken a leading role in funding and directing the search for Madeleine, and Edward Smethurst, a senior Freemason and longtime solicitor for the McCanns. On the surface, this was a highly unusual gathering. At that moment in time, both the McCanns and Murat were suspects in the disappearance of Madeleine. In theory, they were adversaries, not allies. Jane Tanner, one of the McCanns' closest friends, had even identified Murat as the man she claimed to have seen carrying a child away from the Ocean Club on the night of May 3. Other members of the so-called Tapas 7 had also placed him near the scene. Why, then, would the McCann camp send 2 of their heaviest hitters to sit down with him in private? When the Portuguese press uncovered the meeting weeks later, Brian Kennedy offered a benign explanation. He claimed he was simply offering Murat work an opportunity to join the search effort and help find Madeleine. But that account never rang true. Murat was not an investigator, and Kennedy did not need to fly across Europe to hand out employment. Both sides had lawyers present. Both sides had reputations to protect. Something else was happening in that villa. The aftermath offers clues. In the weeks that followed, several of the witnesses who had insisted they saw Murat near the McCann apartment began to soften their claims. Some admitted they might have confused him with someone else, perhaps David Payne, one of the McCann's friends, or even Angus Symington, one of the Ocean Club's owners. What had once been emphatic certainty, "I saw Robert Murat that night," was recast as potential error. This shift was seismic. Murat's status as arguido rested heavily on those identifications. If they crumbled, so too did the case against him, and crumble they did. By July 2008, Portuguese prosecutors dropped his suspect status entirely. Then came the money. Within months, Murat secured a massive libel settlement from the British press, £600,000, split between several newspapers and television outlets that had smeared him as a predator. Not long after, the McCanns themselves won £550,000 from other publications. The timing was remarkable. Both sides, once painted as suspects, now walked away with financial compensation and cleaner reputations. From a purely legal standpoint, these were victories against reckless journalism. The tabloids had printed speculation as fact, ruined reputations, and now had to pay. But from a psychological and political perspective, the settlements looked like something more: a purchase of silence, a smoothing over of inconvenient narratives, a way to remove hostility between camps that should have remained at odds. Was the November meeting at Salsalitas the crucible where this détente was forged? Many observers think so. It is difficult to imagine that Kennedy and Smethurst would sit down with Murat, unless both sides recognized the mutual benefit of reducing conflict. For the McCanns, shifting suspicion away from Murat risked nothing. If anything, it eased the burden of a divided focus. For Murat, backing away from any potential hostility toward the McCann circle opened the path to settlements and the restoration of his public life. The pattern fits what criminologists call informal justice. Outside the courts, outside official police inquiries, stakeholders negotiate deals that stabilize the chaos. These deals are rarely acknowledged publicly, yet their fingerprints can be seen in sudden changes of testimony, abrupt halts to investigations, and financial arrangements that appear suspiciously convenient. The ethical questions are stark. Was Murat paid off, directly or indirectly, to maintain silence about what he had witnessed or learned during those chaotic first days? Did the McCann team strike an understanding that if suspicion against him waned, his cooperation, or at least his neutrality, would be assured? And were the media settlements part of this wider choreography, ensuring that both camps emerged with funds and with their most damaging reputational wounds patched over? From a psychological lens, the November meeting reveals another layer of human behavior, the instinct for survival. Both the McCanns and Murat were under crushing scrutiny. Their lives had been turned upside down by suspicion, by the glare of cameras, by hostile headlines. In such circumstances, alliances can form even between supposed adversaries. Shared peril creates shared interest. The enemy of my enemy, whether that enemy is the press, the Portuguese police, or public opinion, can become my partner. To the public, however, the optics were troubling. The man identified as the abductor meets secretly with the parents' legal and financial backers, and soon afterward witness testimony shifts, suspicion fades, and everyone walks away with cash. Even if the settlements were legally justified, the sequence of events fostered deep distrust. It looked less like justice and more like choreography. The phrase, "the price of silence," hovers over this chapter. Silence can mean many things. Silence about what one saw, silence about what one suspects, silence about the true dynamics of an investigation riddled with contradictions. When silence is accompanied by secrecy and money, suspicion multiplies. For Robert Murat, the meeting may have represented liberation. By aligning, however loosely, with the McCann camp, he gained protection from the most damaging accusations. The withdrawal of witness certainty, the end of his arguido status, and the financial settlement all allowed him to reconstruct his life. For the McCanns, neutralizing Murat removed a rival suspect and simplified the narrative. For both sides, the November meeting can be seen as the turning point, where survival trumped confrontation. But the shadow of that meeting has never lifted. It remains one of the most enigmatic moments in the case, a point where adversaries became collaborators, where silence was cultivated, and where money followed. Was it, as Kennedy insisted, a simple job offer? Or was it, as critics suggest, a dark pact in which testimony, suspicion, and blame were traded like currency? What is certain is that the November meeting shifted the trajectory of the case. The man once painted as the abductor faded from center stage. The parents once branded as suspects regained some ground in the court of public opinion. And the press, chastened by libel payouts, became more cautious in their reporting. In the fog of the Madeleine McCann investigation, the shadow deal at Salsalitas stands out as a rare moment where the forces of law, media, and private interest intersected, not in pursuit of truth, but in pursuit of resolution, however fragile, however manufactured. When looking back at Robert Murat's strange trajectory through the Madeleine McCann investigation, the contradictions are impossible to ignore. He lived barely 100 yards from the McCann's apartment, inserted himself into the investigation as an interpreter almost immediately, and displayed behavior that many officers described as overly eager. Witnesses claim to have seen him near the Ocean Club on the night of May 3. Though his alibi placed him at home with his mother, phone records revealed late-night calls to his fiancée Maikala and to his associate Sergei Malinka, connections that only deepened the sense of suspicion. Add to that reports from his past describing violent or deviant tendencies, and Murat looked, to many, like the perfect candidate for the role of prime suspect. But the case against him never held. Much of the so-called evidence was later undermined or disproven. No DNA linked to Madeleine was ever found in his home or car. The lurid rumors of a secret room at Casa Liliana collapsed under inspection. Some of the key identifications by members of the Tapas 7 were later withdrawn or recast as cases of mistaken identity. By July 2008, Portuguese prosecutors had formally cleared Murat of suspicion. At the same time, there is strong reason to believe that Murat was deliberately placed under the spotlight. The British press vilified him from the first moment he was named Arguido, with tabloids branding him creepy and strange. Behind the scenes, British police officers arrived en masse in Praia da Luz, raising concerns among Portuguese investigators that their presence was more disruptive than supportive. Operation Grange, the Metropolitan Police Review launched in 2011, reinforced the abduction narrative while keeping alternative explanations at bay. Within that carefully controlled narrative, Murat served a useful role: the odd neighbor, the suspicious interpreter, the convenient fall guy. Psychologically, Murat's own behavior invites a darker interpretation. He did not appear outraged when accused, even submitting to questioning without legal counsel. Later, after securing substantial libel settlements, he displayed little visible anger toward those who had falsely identified him. To some analysts, this suggests that he had accepted his function as a Patsy. So long as he was protected from prosecution, so long as compensation restored some of what had been lost, he could live with being the man everyone whispered about. This leaves us at a troubling impasse. If Murat was guilty, why was he never charged, never convicted, never formally tied to forensic evidence? If he was innocent, why did suspicion cling so tightly to him? And why were witnesses, journalists, and even investigators so quick to target him? Was he a dangerous man who escaped accountability, or a neighbor who became collateral damage in a larger effort to shield others? 17 years later, the question remains unresolved. Robert Murat still divides opinion, a shadowy figure forever linked to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And so the final question is not for the investigators or the courts, but for you: was Robert Murat the man who abducted Madeleine? Or was he the victim of a campaign designed to mislead? A scapegoat chosen to bear the weight of a mystery no one dares to solve?